Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future program here. And this is our forum on Broadband Stimulus, which is also being webcast live, and we'll have video on the site later. So if you know anyone who missed it, or you'd like to relive this great moment, feel free to tune into our website. We'll also try to have some links to some of the proposals, and hopefully you've picked up. I think most of the groups have handouts out there. I think it's fairly well known that there is a consensus on the need for broadband stimulus, but clear divides on how the money should be spent. And this gathering turned out to be very timely, since late yesterday the House came out with what is probably a fairly accurate glimpse at what Congress is going to put up for the stimulus package. The draft legislation, and actually there's an article that I put out on the table by Drew Clark from BroadbandCensus.com, who's here in the audience, and it's actually kind of beat the mainstream press hands down in terms of actually getting some of the details of this down. So I just want to summarize a bit of it so that folks know the context for today, which is the House legislation would allocate $6 billion into two pools of $2.85 billion, with one administered by the Rural Utility Service and the other by NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, at the Department of Commerce. And the focus, at least in terms of the House Democrats' proposal, is unserved and underserved areas, and apparently very much oriented towards grants, although with loans being part of the RUS piece. So of the $2.85 billion to be administered by NTIA, $1.85 would be wireline based and $1 billion wireless. And in each case, it's divided between 75% of the funds being targeted for grants to in areas that are underserved, and the remaining 25% to areas currently unserved, with higher speeds required in the underserved areas compared to the unserved areas. And those are all things we'll talk about today in terms of targeting these funds, whether geographically, in terms of areas that are served or not served, in terms of speeds, in terms of incumbents versus entrants, and so on. So what I'd like to do is, we're going to do this a little differently today than normal. So rather than you having to, it would probably take an hour to hear the details of everybody's proposals, kind of one after the other. So what we're going to do instead is chop this up into smaller segments, so we're more or less talking about the same thing. And we're going to start, by asking, each of the panelists to spend just 2 or 3 minutes telling us what they believe is the single most the single most important strategy that they believe should be in the economic stimulus package to promote broadband deployment. But first, let me just run down the row and introduce everyone in the order that they'll go, and then of course after a few lightning rounds of these questions and answers and a bit of debate, we'll open it up to you all as well. So first, immediately to my right here is Debbie Goldman. Debbie is the Telecommunications Policy Director and Research Economist at the Communications Workers of America, CWA, where she directs the union's Speed Matters campaign. And next, Rob Atkinson, who is the president and founder of ITIF, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a Washington, D.C.-based policy think tank that focuses, and Rob focuses his own work a lot on innovation. Wally Bowen is the founder and executive director of the Mountain Area Information Network in Asheville, North Carolina. And Maine is kind of an all-purpose WISP and community broadcaster. Maine includes a local news and information web portal, a low-power FM radio station, and a host of internet services, including broadband wireless. Ben Lennett is here at New America. He's a senior program associate in the Wireless Future program. Ben came to us from the Media Access Project, and he has this, he and Sasha Meinrath, the research director here at Wireless Future, wrote this issue brief that we're releasing today, which Ben will summarize. Derek Turner is the research director for Free Press here in Washington, and he focuses on the implications of media policy-making decisions on media reform goals, and is just kind of an all-around, whiz kid on many of these issues. And then finally, Mark Cooper, director of research at Consumer Federation of America, and also a fellow at the Stanford Law School Center for Internet and Society. So I guess I'll just start by asking you each to spend just 2 or 3 minutes telling us what do you believe is the single most important strategy that should be part of this economic stimulus package to promote broadband, and then we'll go back around in terms of where you might disagree with the perspectives of others and some of the particular issues around speed and targeting and so on. So Debbie?
Thank you.
And you can either stay seated or come up. It's up to you.
Thank you. I think the most important thing, first of all, is for us to find our areas of agreement, or else we're going to blow this opportunity. We know that there is a commitment from the President-elect and soon-to-be President Obama administration to focus on including investment in 21st century communications infrastructure in a stimulus, and to see this as a way to create jobs in the short term while building long-term competitiveness. If we here focus on the areas that we don't agree on, we're going to blow this opportunity. So I think that's the most important thing. And so I want to go through. The first thing is we've got to recognize this is a stimulus bill. It's not our only opportunity. We don't throw in the kitchen sink. We've got to focus on creating jobs. Our union represents 300,000 people whose livelihoods are at stake here. We've already gotten layoff notices at AT&T just in the past month. Wall Street is predicting a 10% downturn in telecom spending. 60% of the jobs in telecom are the 7 top carriers. 4 of them rural, primarily rural carriers, 3 of them carriers that serve both urban and rural areas, but all are the biggest rural carriers. Together cover more rural area than add up every single other smaller carrier. So if we're going to talk about creating jobs and maintaining jobs, we've got to be technology neutral, and we've got to be neutral in terms of where this money goes. But we've got to make sure that it's going to companies and organizations that know how to spend the money and how to operate networks, how to build networks, and can do it fast. So I think there's agreement that there's, first we have to have good data about that. And fortunately, the House bill does include some money so that we can finally get some good data about where do we and where don't we have broadband so we can target our money. Second, we've got to recognize that building out into low-density areas is very expensive, and the House bill has money for rural broadband. I can quibble with some of the ways in which they have structured that, and I will as we talk, but it is a positive that there's money for recognizing rural broadband. Third, we've got a huge speed gap, and if you picked up the CWA Speed Matters materials, you know that we've been promoting that problem for over 2 years. I don't think that's going to be addressed through grants. I cannot see how that problem is primarily addressed through grants. That problem is addressed by those companies that have business models to make this succeed and to operate those networks, being able to lower the cost of capital so they can accelerate what they do, which means, in my view, some kind of targeted temporary tax credit for new investment. And we can define new investment. New investment means you take what they spent in '08, you assume that there's going to be some kind of a reduction in that investment in a recession, and new investment at the speeds that you've set. And we've said 85% of, the benchmark would be 85% of '08 spending. Get some kind of an incentive. Temporary, 3 years, spend the money, you've got your plans, build faster. And the fourth piece is that we also have to be flexible about those grants that I talked about, because there's a lot of interesting programs that would be public-private partnerships to stimulate demand, hooking up all the rural health care centers, all the community centers, senior centers, that particularly in rural areas, you'd know the demand, you'd have a functioning business model and proceed. So our members, 300,000 people who 50 years ago, valiant, brave people, fought to build a union, create good, stable, secure jobs, and they've continued. And that union model has meant that at least as the industry has gotten more competitive, there is a bar for good wages and benefits that those who are resisting the representation of their employees at least have to meet. And those are good jobs, and we've got to see that we have programs so that in this recession, those career good jobs for women primarily and men, because it's 50% women in this industry, do not go away. So those are our priorities. Thank you.
I'll speak from here. I would basically say I would agree with everything Debbie said, but unfortunately I'm not that. I'm too loquacious to stop there. I do want to say though, I think we have got to focus on what this is all about. This is not about broadband reform. This is about stimulus. And it's easy for us in Washington to sort of think about it's about reform because the unemployment rate in Washington is quite low. We all have jobs, and I'm not saying there isn't some economic risk in Washington, but when you go around the country where there are, 500,000 jobs lost in the last month, and expectations of continued job loss, stimulus has to have one goal, and that is to get as much investment in as fast a time as possible. The nice ancillary benefit of why we support broadband being in the stimulus package is because it gets you this other benefit, which is you now have infrastructure that's going to serve America well for many, many years after that. But the goal should be to get as much investment as possible, and that means it has to be an incentive package, or a funding package, I should say, that includes and is eligible for and is likely to be taken advantage of by every single broadband provider in the country. Whether it's wireless, wireline, CLEC, incumbent, cable, telco, doesn't make any difference. Everybody, we want everybody to invest. The second point is we want it to be done quickly. And while I applaud the House and the Obama transition team for the work they've done on this, my worry is that if you just do grants, which is what they have focused on so far, particularly in the House, what you end up seeing is that not a lot of investment's going to get made in '09. And the result will be an opportunity that has been missed. I will quote from the transition team's own study, which was released last weekend. Romer's piece showed that tax incentives, 83% of any tax incentive gets into the economy in year one. 46% of a grant gets into the economy in year one. So what you're doing by relying only on grants is essentially saying we're going to backload a lot of this and we're going to avoid investment up front. One of the risks of doing that is that there are capacity constraints here. I mean, we cannot, for example, if Congress wanted to put $100 billion into broadband, which would be nice, but the problem is there's not $100 billion of work out there that can be done because you have worker constraints, even with layoffs. There's only so many people you can do. So to sort of backload it all and say most of it's going to happen in 10 as opposed to 9, I think is running a risk that we're not going to be able to do it. The second problem I have, the second thing part I have, and then I'll get to what I think we should do, is I think it's a mistake to drive reform through this agenda, because all reform is going to do is take away, each reform is going to take away one or more companies from participating in that. And you're going to end up with simply less broadband investment. And they're basically inversely correlated. The more reform, the more rules, the more requirements, the less investment. So for example, speed requirements in the House bill essentially will leave out, and I'm not talking about, I don't have any stake in any particular company doing better or better than another. What I do have a stake in is getting as much companies as possible to invest. The speed requirements in the House bill for what's defined as advanced broadband will simply get zero investment from companies like Qwest and AT&T. They cannot, even if they wanted to, even if you gave them 100% subsidy, they cannot change their technology model and their business model within 1 year. That's just simply not going to happen. They're basically in a fiber to the node model, which doesn't meet a 50 meg requirement. The second problem I have with what's in the House is there's a definition of openness. And again, you can argue whether openness is good or bad, although it certainly sounds good. In reality, if you put an openness requirement on these subsidies, you will get significantly fewer takers. You will get significantly less investment. For a lot of these companies, if you trade openness with a little bit of incentive, the incentive is not going to outweigh what they see as the challenges or problems with openness. The last point is, when we will certainly hear about, I think, on this panel is, well, we have to make sure this is not business as usual. We have to make sure this has a lot of accountability. And I remember, in fact, Danny, you were in that meeting, a meeting with the transition team early on, and they said, we need to make sure we've got really good numbers to justify broadband investments. And I said, I'm happy to help you with that, but I got to tell you, broadband is being held to a higher standard than virtually everything else in this debate. Who's giving the higher standard to the AMT? Okay, the AMT fix is not going to be stimulative at all, or very little of it. Where is the accountability for doing net loss carry forward? Where is the accountability for doing small business first year expensing? Is anybody talking about, isn't that a windfall for companies doing first year expensing? I'm not, because I don't have a problem with it. But if you're going to hold broadband to a higher standard of accountability than the other stimulus measures, I don't see the logic for doing that. If anything, you want to hold it to a lower level of accountability, because at the end of the day, you get something. So what do we think we should do? We've got a proposal out there which is on the table, but I'm only really going to talk about one thing, and that's to follow on with what Debbie said. The thing that's missing so far in the proposals, in my view, is some sort of tax credit. We have a little bit different view maybe than CWA. We think there should be both rural tax credits. Our proposal is 20 and 40%, depending upon the density of the population area and the cost of deploying. But more importantly, we think there should be a speed tax credit, 30% for 20 meg and above. I'm sorry, that's the rural one. 20% for 20 meg and above, 40% for 50 meg and above, but tied to, as Debbie alluded to, an 85% CapEx base. So if a company's CapEx in 2008 was a certain amount of money, they would get a tax credit of those numbers for everything over that amount of CapEx in a percentage basis. So that's what I think the most important thing we're missing in the bill is, and I'm hopeful, or I will hope that that gets put in somewhere, and that we have a broadband stimulus that does everything we want. Thank you.
Okay, Wally, you're what you'd most like to see?
Well, I've got some prepared remarks since we do have a little bit of a time limit, so just let me know if I go over. But I just want to make clear that we are a nonprofit. We are an internet service provider. We've been operating since 1996 in the rural counties of the mountains of North Carolina, including the county where Asheville is located, where people had to call long distance back in 1996 to reach the internet, and there was no public access in our public libraries. So that's my background. We're on the ground operational, and that's the perspective that I bring. But I want to reference the piece that Professor Atkinson published earlier a few days ago, entitled "The Right Broadband Stimulus Package," in which he called on making sure that this is based on pragmatic logic rather than ideological thinking. And we've heard him say, that tax credits for the big cable and incumbent telephone companies is the way to go. But I believe that that fails the test of pragmatism from where I'm at ground level, where we operate. Now, President Obama has made it very clear that this is a stimulus bill, that these projects need to have a quick impact. They need to be, quote, shovel ready. And Professor Atkinson writes about that, quote, if Congress is serious about using the stimulus package to really drive broadband deployment in 2009, it needs to ensure that a sizable portion of any stimulus package is focused on tax credits to companies to deploy broadband in areas without it and to expand speeds in areas with it, end quote. So, but for me, this is where the wheels fall off of pragmatic logic, because any local economic development official, and particularly in the neck of woods where I live, will tell you that the big telephone and cable companies are the last place to look for shovel-ready projects in underserved areas. That's just not where they have set their sights for all these years. So in the mountains of North Carolina, Verizon, AT&T, and Charter probably control more than 90% of all the landline connections. And so and our local politicians and economic development officials and the state's broadband authority gave up years ago trying to pressure them or bribe them to deploy broadband infrastructure to our underserved neighborhoods and underserved communities. So the idea that these carriers might suddenly produce plans for shovel-ready broadband projects in our rural mountains is more akin to magical thinking than pragmatic logic. Instead, we're far more likely to find shovel-ready projects on the drawing boards of local planning agencies and state broadband initiatives like the North Carolina Rural Internet Access Authority, which is now called the ENC Authority, and which is very instrumental in helping us get a half dozen nonprofit fiber networks operational in the mountain region. So frustrated by the neglect of the big telephone and cable companies in western North Carolina, our local planning agencies and nonprofits like the one that I run, we came together more than 10 years ago to begin mapping out our own broadband infrastructure and building it. So today we have approximately 600 miles of lighted fiber operated by 4 nonprofit networks, plus 1 public-private partnership anchored by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And then there's another nonprofit telephone cooperative in the far northeastern mountains up around Wilkes County. And we haven't been able to get their number of miles of fiber they have, but they're also operational. So my concern is that these proposed tax credits for the big cable and phone companies could turn out to be a bait-and-switch proposition. And when Professor Atkinson writes that a sizable portion of the stimulus package should go to these companies to deploy broadband in areas without it, that could be the bait. But then follows that by saying, or to expand speeds in areas with it, that could be the switch. And that's the real concern I have about the tax credit path. So if you're the CEO of one of these Fortune 500 companies, your investment strategy is aimed at major corporate clients in affluent residential neighborhoods where the return on investment is greatest. So the choice presented by the tax credit stimulus proposal is a no-brainer to that CEO. You're going to use those tax credits to increase speeds, become more competitive in those markets where you already have broadband service. And besides that, your shovel-ready projects are all aimed at these lucrative market sectors. You're very unlikely to have shovel-ready projects aimed at underserved areas. That seems so obvious and self-evident from where I come from in the mountains of North Carolina. So right off the bat, the tax credit proposal fails the shovel-ready test. Again, if shovel-ready projects are on the drawing boards of these Fortune, few if any shovel-ready projects will be on the drawing boards of these Fortune 500 companies in underserved areas. And any CEO who redirects his company's investment strategy toward markets that aren't a good fit for that Wall Street business model is putting his career at risk. So why are we trying to bribe the big cable and phone companies to go where their Wall Street business models have no future? And that's a question, we really need to think seriously about. Meanwhile, we all need to remember President Obama's second major requirement for the stimulus package is that it be a good use of our taxpayer dollars. And for the stimulus package, as well as the second year of the economic recovery package, it makes far more sense to direct broadband infrastructure funding to local networks, the local and regional nonprofits, telephone and utility cooperatives, and the municipal networks that have been springing up all around this country. These are the networks that are most likely to have shovel-ready broadband projects. These networks also have a number of other advantages, and we can talk about this in more detail. But it's very important that they are more easily held accountable for the taxpayer dollars that are going to be in the stimulus package. I've been operating a nonprofit last mile network in North Carolina since 1996, and the folks who are still suffering with dial-up will be watching this broadband stimulus package very, very closely. And the local network operators live in the communities they serve. It's going to be easier to hold these operators more accountable than it is these Fortune 500 companies, which have very almost no presence in our communities. Anyone you can get in touch with a local phone call.
I think we can come back on.
Okay.
Yeah, we can come back on.
Yeah, and
some of those other issues, because we're going to
Good.
talk about some of them one at a time. Okay. Go next to Ben Lennon. And so let me say, Rob and Wally took the opportunity to anticipate the next question, which is what don't you like, in this debate? But if the remaining three here can just talk about what you do want or do like, then we're going to come around and Debbie will start off with an opportunity to say what she disagrees with, and we'll probably skip Rob and Wally at that point.
Yeah. I only take 3 minutes. Let me come back this way because they already said like 7 or 8 each. So.
Okay, Ben.
Well, I think that's a bit of a harder question to answer, but I think in terms of the actual stimulus, the short-term stimulus that we're looking at now, I think sort of the focus on rural is certainly merited. These are the areas of greatest need. These are the areas where basic broadband connectivity is going to provide the most good, and where you're likely to get to see your money actually return. You see a return on the investment. My sort of not to answer Michael's question, but my sort of concern with how we're sort of looking at all of these problems with broadband is that we continue to sort of focus on sort of short-term Band-Aid approaches without having any sense of where we need to go and building in policy mechanisms and recommendations that are going to be focused on long-term approaches to building networks that can not just sort of get us parity with countries right now, but that are going to be able to handle the demands of the future. And so my sense is that we're not viewing broadband as actually infrastructure. We're still sort of viewing it as a basic connectivity or a luxury service. And so until we actually begin to incorporate broadband as a primary and important infrastructure, we're never going to solve any of the issues that we're continuing to debate here. And so we actually have a paper out front, and the idea is that we begin to sort of a top-down sort of approach to broadband where we incorporate it into every sort of facet of building our nation. And so the idea is that you can have sort of the infrastructure in place that is going to benefit all sorts of connectivity services, from wireless to fiber to DSL, and all those that are going to, and the essence is to bring the necessary high bandwidth fiber optic connectivity to every single community. And so what you can have then is a benefit of giving sort of the platform that you're going to need for next generation networks. And I think it's a much better approach, because the essence of infrastructure is that investing in infrastructure is not only as a short-term stimulus, but as a long-term stimulus, is that you get the benefits of building new infrastructure or upgrading new infrastructure, and then you have the added benefits that it increases in terms of economic growth and commerce and so forth. And so we need to sort of recognize that as part of broadband. And so what sort of, if we look at it in that way, and we look at sort of how can we make not just rural networks build out, but actually make them sustainable, focusing on sort of the basic infrastructure of broadband, which is the necessary middle mile links and your connection to the backbone of the network, which you absolutely need as part of being an internet service provider, because it's not just building out into the neighborhood. You have to be able to carry that data back to the backbone and to connect to the broader internet. And so that's a huge cost in rural areas. And it's only going to increase as people consume more and more bandwidth. And that's only going to make these rural networks less sustainable, because their costs are going to go through the roof and their profit margins are already razor thin. So I don't want to go into too much detail about the plan. I mean, you can read the paper. But I do want to sort of set the idea that we need to begin to think about long-term approaches to this. And maybe the stimulus is not the best avenue to do this, but looking at ways that we can sort of provide the necessary platforms to create, to have the adequate capacity in every single community to build these actual networks of the future, and to not just sort of aim for a Band-Aid approach or adequate, but aim to be, once again, a technological leader in the world.
Okay, so I'm actually going to try to stick to 3 minutes here, and I'll stop myself if I go over. I just want to start with the premise that though Free Press as an organization has plenty of goals that we want to see happen in the broadband market, we are practical and recognize that the stimulus package is not the vehicle to achieve those goals. I have no misconceptions that we can use stimulus to solve problems of competition, that we can use stimulus to solve problems of service quality. We can use it to solve part of the problem of the issue of availability of broadband. And so that is what I think is the most important thing that should be focused on here. If we accept the premise that there's not going to be enough money in the stimulus package to build a broadband utopia, then we should be focusing on the unserved areas of the country where no broadband is available, and where the investment equation is such that no broadband investment would probably take place there absent some sort of grant infusion from the government. It's also the best use of money from an economic efficiency standpoint, because a lot of these areas have pent-up demand, and you're able to maximize consumer surplus by putting your money there as opposed to putting it in an area where that is already served. I think that grants are probably the best way to go here. I'm a lot more suspect of the loan approach, and I'm very suspect of how Congress has allocated money to the Rural Utility Services program, which I think is a very flawed program, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I think grants, in the way they're awarded, allows for flexibility. It allows for the person or the agency giving the grant to give priority to certain types of networks and give and recognize when those benchmarks and those priorities need to be adjusted. But I do think that the priority here, since the pool of money is limited, is for future-proof networks that meet a basic level of broadband today, but can easily be scaled up to meet the demands of tomorrow, because we don't want to be back at the table doing this all over again. We don't want to have to blow up the size of the Universal Service Fund, so we want to be smart about how we do this. In our proposal, we basically tried to cover a wide variety of things. We did have some tax incentives in our proposal, but I'm not very disappointed that the tax incentives are not in the proposal or in the bill that came out yesterday, primarily because it's much harder to know what your money is buying in that instance. And we can talk about this in detail. I wanted to get into it when we had a panel earlier this week on this, but while I think the notion of an 85% level of an investment over that gets credit or gets tax credits or depreciation or whatever it may be, I think that's a way to quickly lose the money and not figure out where the money's going. In fact, it's a way that will lead to outcomes such as cable companies actually using the money to pay to convert analog customers to digital. So it has nothing to do with broadband. And finally, there are some openness conditions in the bill, and I think that's fine. And I disagree that will deter investment, because what we're doing, we gotta be honest about what we're doing here. We want to be building the kind of networks that led to the internet being what it is today, and that is primarily because the network is open and a platform for innovation. all of the job numbers you see thrown around, if you see the word network effect jobs and things like that, those jobs probably wouldn't exist, and those network effects wouldn't be as great if it wasn't for the openness and the ability for any applications provider to use the internet as a platform for innovation. So I am very glad that the concepts of openness and are in this legislation, and I hope it's something that doesn't get stripped out in the name of compromise.
I actually believe that this is still about good public policy. And I've actually made a New Year's resolution to start every speech and presentation, every paper, with one fundamental observation. On October 23, 2008, the era of irrational exuberance for deregulation was ended symbolically by Alan Greenspan, one of the leading architects of market fundamentalism, when he admitted that there was a flaw in his theory, and I quote, "Those of us who look to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked disbelief." He went on to admit that he, quote, "made a mistake in presuming that the self-interests of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in the firm." Public interest advocates have always believed that the pursuit of private profit is not always synonymous with the public good. Alan Greenspan has gone us one step better. He now recognizes that the pursuit of private profit is not always synonymous with the private good. This is a fundamental observation about policy from which I want policymaking to begin in America. The age of market fundamentalism, with its ideological belief that markets are always right, that wealth should trickle down, and that less government is better, is simply over. Public policy must start from a new understanding of the role of government and the private sector. In the broadband space, for us, it is clear that the cozy duopoly of telcos and cable companies has failed to deliver adequate service at reasonable charges, as required by the Communications Act. The stimulus package provides an ideal opportunity to try a different approach, change we can believe in. We should invest as much in human capital and social tools as we do in physical infrastructure. The physical infrastructure we need should be citizen and consumer friendly. Therefore, we have recommended a community-based wireless 3G and 4G approach, WiMAX and Wi-Fi, centered in a public gigabit backbone. We want to pull the backbone throughout the community to all the buildings, government buildings, schools, libraries. We want to create the middle mile to the internet. This will act as a local community network with hotspots in every community to light up that community. Local government will be the anchor tenant, meeting all of its communications needs and provide basic service for the community. Low bandwidth applications like email, chat, and web browsing at no charge. If people want higher service, they can pay for it at cost. This physical infrastructure should be combined with human capital and training, social networking activities grounded in the community, funded through, we can spend money on creating all kinds of training programs for local operators, building local applications to create a real local community ecology, a communications ecology. The simple fact of the matter is that the one-way push mentality of the cable companies and the centralized network mentality of the telcos will never deliver the kind of open communications network we really need to build a 21st century digital economy. Now, the private sector can certainly build its 100 megabit push service network and sell it to the public. I'm not against that. What I am for, however, is making sure that we have a basic set of communications functions available for all people in this country. And it's time for local government to build and operate those networks or contract with the private sector to operate networks that are in fact owned and driven by the public interest. The way they built the roads and the streets of the 20th century, they can build the roads and the streets of the 21st century.
All right. Thanks, Mark. I just want to also take my moderator's prerogative to just, mention that, in part, some of what you'll be hearing from New America is as Ben, to reiterate what Ben said, is we'd like to also be thinking a little bit outside the short-term broadband box. And so, two things along those lines. One, as Ben said, is that we have, they're talking $6 billion for broadband. In the House bill, we're probably going to be spending something like, over $100 billion on traditional infrastructure, and much more when you consider the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation, Act, the Federal Highway Act. And so this notion of leveraging for an incremental $1 to $3 billion, we can leverage all the, the hundreds of billions of dollars we'll spend on traditional infrastructure to incorporate, fiber optic, conduits and dark fiber along all the roads and highways and bridges, going out over the next 5 years, and providing that middle mile, over 160,000 miles of surface road as part of the National Highway System, providing that middle mile network will just make it much cheaper and faster for all broadband providers, whether they be the commercial incumbents, WiMAX, cellular, anybody, to build out their own private networks. And the second thing that you'll be hearing more from us too is that although it's not, in a sense, stimulus, it stimulates the stimulus, I think, to think about spectrum policy. At the same time, we were very heartened to see wireless in the, have a prominent place in the House Democrats' proposal for these broadband grants. But what you need at the same time is more access to the airwaves. And so what, again, you'll be hearing more from us is proposals to build on the recent TV white space order from the FCC to have opportunistic access to much more of the airwaves that are currently being wasted, so that, again, both the licensed and the unlicensed users will have far more spectrum. The federal government itself is a treasure trove of this unused spectrum. And now that we're going to have a database that will tell you which TV stations are empty and available for use in each discrete geographic area, we can add on to that and add lots of other bands of wasted spectrum, federal spectrum and other spectrum that's lying fallow. And that's going to, be, again, not a dollar item to the government necessarily, but it's going to be a big pump primer as well. So let's go back around and have Debbie, Ben, Derek, and Mark just tell us if there's anything that they missed critiquing as far as, again, in like 2 minutes, because now we're going to move on to the lightning rounds part of this. But in terms of other, what you heard from the other speakers that you kind of liked the least, or the thing in this debate that you think would be the least effective in terms of broadband stimulus or deployment. Debbie?
I'm going to forego my time, and so that we have opportunity for a lot of audience questions.
Okay.
Yield back the balance.
Well, I want to make one observation about the tax and depreciation approach, and I want to remind people that it's really easy to spend a couple $100 billion in this space and end up with nothing. And as a consumer advocate, I appeared in a series of rate cases in the early 90s, late 80s, in which the telephone companies said, look, we got to get rid of this copper. Let us accelerate the depreciation of the copper. Give us rate cap regulation so that we can have the incentive to get the revenues from the new services on this network. And we will pull fiber all over the place. We used to call it fiber to the outhouse. They got those incentives. And by some counts, it's a couple $100 billion, and they didn't build the network. They failed to build the network because accelerated depreciation and tax credits are simply very, very difficult items to hold people's feet to the fire on. And so from our point of view, the proposals for tax credits for 85% of this and that, etc., it really suggests that you're going to end up with a bailout for the banks, right? We give the banks money and they put it in their pocket. and how you make sure they disgorge it on something that they were not going to do otherwise is an extremely challenging task. So this turns into corporate welfare that doesn't get us what we paid for. So our concern is to make sure that, having paid for the network the first time and we didn't get it, if we pay for it a second time, we really have to make sure we get the network that we pay for and need.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, while I do think there was a massive broadband boondoggle that Cooper's describing here, I think it's been greatly exaggerated. They didn't build T3s to every residence, but there was a substantial amount of investment in fiber deployment in the middle mile and backbone of the network during that time. So we have to be a little honest with that. The one thing that I would talk about in specifically this, and I brought this up the first time, and I should probably explain it a little bit more, the notion of a tax incentive for anything above 85% of CapEx spending is administratively great. It's very easy to do. You just look at a balance sheet, and it's a very easy thing to run. But however, let's get the example of a company that, let's say they had $100 million in CapEx expenditures in 2008, and they're planning $100 million in 2009. Let's also say that in 2008 they spent $30 million on advanced broadband, or $30 million on advanced broadband, and under this plan in 2009 they can cut that in half and spend 15 million. So as long as they made at least 15 million investment in advanced broadband, they still get a tax credit for any other capital investment they made above the 85% threshold. So there's no way to follow the money. There's no way to actually ensure that there is increased broadband investment, or that it's actually new broadband investment that wouldn't have taken place absent any type of incentive. So I mean that's the one thing that I would say. The other is the notion of the speed requirements sometimes will shut out certain companies like Qwest and AT&T. Great, fine. If they don't have it in their plans to build the type of networks that we think need to be built, then so what? But I would say that though that's not their fundamental primary deployment, they do, when there's greenfield projects, they do pull fiber usually to the house. So it's not something that's completely out of the realm for them to be able to do. And the other notion is when Dr. Atkins said that there's not $100 billion in projects to do, that's absolutely correct, which is why I'm a little bit concerned about the money going to RUS. It could be used for loans, because the amount of money that they were given, if they used all of that for loans, we're talking about $100 billion worth of loans, and 50 billion of those loans have to be made before September 30th of this year. So I think a lot of that money is going to sit on the table and get wasted. I think an agency like NTIA, via the FCC or the USAC, which has feelers out into every community in the country, is probably a lot more better equipped to getting the money allocated in a reasonable and timely fashion.
Ben, do you have something?
Yeah. Not to sort of just keep the same theme going, but I do think it's, the danger with tax credits and specific tax incentives and depreciation credits and all this is that, are we going to get the networks that we need? I mean, we have broadband in a lot of places, suburban, urban areas, and speeds are getting somewhat better, but these are networks that are very limited. I mean, these are networks that are designed to deliver content. They're not designed for next generation applications such as telehealth, distance learning. All these sort of innovative ideas that we've been hearing about for years are not going to happen if we continue to design networks and rely upon cable and telephone providers who are just simply interested in delivering content. And so how are we going to stimulate the kind of networks that we're going to need that are actually going to provide some incredible public benefits going forward, and not sort of continue to do what we've been doing?
Yeah, I was going to ask next, in fact, about this debate concerning tax incentives versus direct grants. So since Mark and Derek got us into that pretty well, why don't we start by having Rob and Debbie respond, I guess, on that point primarily on what should we have tax incentives, and why is that better than direct grants? And then if anybody wants to respond to that before we go on to the next issue.
Yeah, I feel like in the spirit of Manichaeism here, I should basically say I oppose all grants. But if you read our report, it's actually we support grants and we've pushed for grants, and the plan that we gave to the administration. I'm happy to send anybody the spreadsheet. I don't remember the exact numbers, but over 50% of the money we thought would be invested in our proposal was in grants. So, and absolutely the places where you're talking about grants are going to be a big component of that. So I'm not saying we don't support grants. What I am saying is that you have to do both. With regard to just Wally's point on bait and switch and the sort of broader point about how do you know it's going to get there, the reason incumbents don't build in rural areas is it costs too much. The reason why incumbents in Sweden built in rural areas is because they got a subsidy, and a tax subsidy at that, and a grant subsidy. So yes, there's a reason they don't do it. If you look at what our tax credit proposals are, we have two. One is only for rural. And you can't use it anyplace else, and it's 100% of CapEx for rural areas that are I shouldn't say rural, I should say unserved. And then the second is a speed one. So again, I have to go back to Mark's point about, you could blow $100 billion on this. First of all, if you did full expensing for the entire U.S. economy, you're way below $100 billion. Secondly, the tax credits that we've proposed, again, I'm happy to share that with anybody who would like to see it. Again, my rough guess on those is we're talking about $5 to $6 billion. If you used every single tax credit in that, if every single company had used it at the max, we're talking $5 to $6 billion. So there are limits there to that. Secondly, lastly, with Derek's point, no accountability and you don't know what you're going to get. Certainly there's accountability on the rural because you only get it for building rural networks. And on the speed one, I do believe there's accountability because most of the investment today is in going to build faster networks in broadband. They're not spending a lot of money on revamping their wire line, their telephone wire line. So I just think that, in the sake of perfection rather than the good, we're going to basically limit a lot of investment because we're saying, well, we can't guarantee that 100% of this is not going to go to broadband. We can't. But the reality is the vast majority of it will.
And I'd add to that Rob's point. I think we need to look at, I want those in the back to be able to see me, so I always hate standing in the back and not being seen, being able to see the speakers. But I think we do need to, again, focus on what is for what purposes. And also recognize how do you leverage the public monies to encourage greater investment by private capital. And one of the problems that I had when I read the House proposal yesterday is they have absolutely no requirement for a matching grant. So that an entity that has absolutely no experience, has shown no operational experience, no ability to raise the kind of capital they're going to need once they get it built to continually operate it, can come and apply for a grant. Now, to be sure, these are competitive grants, and the NTIA or the RUS could turn them down. However, in the programs that are operating in the states where there are funding for rural grants to build out to unserved areas, every state has required some kind of a match. And so they're able to take their $1 invested and make it in cent 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 times the amount that they're putting in. So even in tweaking what we've got now, I think this no match piece of the grant is ill-conceived. And it does worry me, therefore, that there are pieces, now we can improve it, but that there are pieces even in a way that the House has put the rural grant proposal that could be throwing money at building networks that then don't have the either operational ability or the capacity. We've seen this ourselves when experienced network operators, in order to make higher profits or get rid of their rural lines, sell out to companies that are basically seeing themselves as cash cows, get the dividends, get the universal service money, and let the network deteriorate so they can pay high dividends to their shareholders. So I have absolutely no conviction that grants can also not be need to be monitored. The match requirement, if you were going to ask me about it, is there is a criteria that would favor those that apply and put in a 20% match, but that's it. I continue to believe that we've got 3 areas we've got to deal with. One is the unserved areas. They're very expensive. Grants with accountability and a match make sense. We have speed gaps. That's an incremental build-out. You don't jump from no demand to the most expensive network. We need to incrementally move forward on our speed gaps, and the tax incentives are the way to go there. And then we've got to, at the same time, be stimulating demand, because you can build these networks, and unless you have the demand for it, you don't have a business case to keep operating them.
I would offer a couple observations. I actually agree with the last, although that is you have to worry about stimulating demand. I'm not sure Debbie and I agree on how you do that. But so accountability for me has 3 things. What are you going to build, which is what we've been talking about in terms of speed. How are you going to operate it, which we heard that if we tell them to operate it in an open fashion, they won't build it. And third, what are you going to charge for it? And that's the demand part. And so, frankly, Bob talked about subsidies, and historically, American telecommunications policy was riddled with subsidies. That's how we actually have built every major national network has been built in this country on the basis of a fundamental public interest obligation and a series of subsidies that was flowed around to get the network into the places where it wasn't going to go otherwise. But the key issue there was that the subsidies came along with an obligation to serve and a obligation on price. If I don't get a commitment on price that goes along with this tax subsidy, I'm not going to stimulate demand, because those networks are going to keep pricing out of the market the very people who aren't on broadband today. Those are the people we need to get on broadband, because the majority of people who don't have broadband have a choice.
Mark, how are you going to pay for public universal networks? What do you estimate it'll cost, and how are you going to pay for it?
Well, I've suggested that if we can't have a national policy that we had for 100 years, which involved those subsidies, what we do is shift to this alternative of community-based policy. That's not the policy we pursued for 100 years. But if you give these tax credits and you don't get commitments on price and you don't get commitments on operation, you'll never get them. Let's be clear. People are saying, let's do stimulus now and reform later. You've heard the answer. Once you've done stimulus, when you start talking about reform, you're going to be told that, you just destroyed stimulus, we're not going to play anymore. If you don't get reform now, tied to this money, you're not going to get either stimulus or reform.
Okay, I'm going to combine my last 2 questions because they're related, and so that we can go out to the audience a little quicker. So we'll do one more lightning round here of responses, and everyone's been nibbling around this. So I'll just ask somewhat directly, I guess, which is, what is the most important string that you would tie to any federal subsidy, such as, whether it be in terms of speed, targeting underserved areas, openness. Try not to give me 4, because we're all talking about, maybe the same different ones, but, what seems to be most important? And then as part of that, if you could mention what you think about, whether it should be conditioned, to what degree, the stimulus package should be conditioned. How important is it to condition it on speed alone? In other words, so when we're talking up at 50 megabits per second or even 100, is that really of high importance right now? So if you're not choosing that as kind of the most important, I'd love to hear why not.
We have an excellent model for broadband grants to stimulate deployment in high-cost rural areas out of California. California established an advanced services fund. They then said, okay, here's the criteria that any grant application has to meet. And they were a lot clearer than you see right now in this bill. They said, we're going to set a minimum speed of 3 megs down, 1 up, but if you can go faster, put that in your application. But that's our minimum. And we're going to look at the price, and we're going to look at how fast you're going to get it out, and we're going to look at the areas you claim that you're going to go into. If it's unserved, we'll fund that before the underserved. And those were some of the main criteria. There were others. And then they said, provide us grant applications. And by the way, you have to provide a match, which I've been told by some, the match was too high for some of these very, very rural areas. And the other thing was that California had been ahead a lot of the rest of the country in that they had already mapped their unserved areas, and they had done speed mapping. So that when they got the applications, they had the data. And thank goodness in this House bill, we do finally have funding, so we're going to get this kind of data. So we don't have to put the cart before the horse, but we're doing it at the same time. I think that's the way in which you do criteria. You say, here's our bottom lines, recognizing that providers working in partnership with local communities can figure out what's going to be economic, not just to build, but to operate the networks and keep them going. And I think that's the way that we do the rural broadband grants.
I should have noted actually that, just as context for this, that in the House, I didn't say it at the beginning purposely, at least in terms of what the House Democrats' proposal would give NTIA, the 75% of the funds that goes to underserved would have would require speeds of 45 down and 15 up, and the smaller amount, the 25%, for unserved areas, 5 down and 1 up. And so, it's an interesting. That's for wireline, and wireless less so, 3 and 1. So anyway, that's just some context in terms of some people very happy or unhappy or don't think it's important. In fact, can we go over to Mark on this? Because I think you're sometimes contrarian on this issue.
I'm not a big fan of the 100 megabit network. I think it's great, and it'll come, and maybe it'll come in whatever number of years. But my problem now is to get a nice national, I like to call it the subway system, right? You give people basic transportation that they can use for the age. The numbers of 3 and 1 and 5 and 1, I've heard that people think WiMAX will do 10 and 2, and that's going to be really important for rural areas. The most important thing is to remember the history, and I've unfortunately been doing this since it started. Remember that 300 baud modem that we used to plug the phone into? And they told me that copper was just useless, right? And we actually took copper a long way. We squeezed more and more into copper. We went through the first generation of the internet, and actually there are people who are getting 50 and 100 out of copper in big cities. So I'm not so concerned about getting that 100 megabit network, which is what drives a lot of the debate. I'm interested in getting a minimum standard that covers the whole country. And frankly, if you live in rural America and you could get 10 and 2, you would be in nirvana compared to where you are today. And that gets us to a national. And once you've got 10 and 2, capitalism is a wonderful thing. People will figure out how to squeeze an incredible amount of stuff into a 10 and 2 line because they don't want to have to incur the cost of the much bigger lines. We'll have the same benefit we had with that 300 baud copper line that carried us so far.
In our proposal, we obviously focused a lot on the speeds, though we did have different levels of incentives for different levels of speed. But if we accept the premise, which I strongly believe in, that we should be making the types of investment that the private market wouldn't make otherwise, I think putting the speed definitions very high is very important. For one reason, we don't know what the LTE deployment plans of the carriers who just bought 700 megahertz spectrum is going to be. It's possible that 10 and 2 will be something that is deployed universal in the next 3 or 4 years anyway, absent any type of government assistance. The other reason I think speed is so important in the context of the stimulus bill is speed directly correlates to jobs. It takes a lot of people to dig up a trench and to lay new fiber optics than it does for a single technician to go in and replace a CMTS card for an entire neighborhood for a cable system to upgrade to DOCSIS 3.0. It takes one person versus maybe dozens of people, and the speed outcome is about the same. So I think it's really important from a jobs creation standpoint to get the speeds as high as possible. And to answer Mike's original question, what is the one element, well, the one string that we'd like to see on any federal subsidy? Well, I think all of them are very important, but if I was narrowed down to one, I would probably say the openness conditions. We don't want to be using federal dollars to fund networks that are closed and that are discriminatory.
Oh, must have come down the line, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I think the key thing to sort of think about is, do we want to give, particularly in rural areas where it's going to be harder to sort of go back and upgrade networks, do we want to give them inferior networks? Do we want to give them second-best networks just because they're in rural areas? And so speed requirements are important, and in fact, they're critical in that sense. And, and in some ways, they're going to need higher speeds than urban areas, because if you think about the kinds of services that we can use the internet for and to benefit rural communities, things like telehealth, things like distance learning, putting government services online, you're going to need fast speeds and lots of capacity, and you're also going to need symmetric speeds, which is the ability to not just receive information but send information out of the community. And so there's just no way that we can, sort of give a Band-Aid here, a Band-Aid there to get them to 5 or 1 mega, 5 to 1. I mean, that's just not going to cut it 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, and we're going to be having this discussion again, and we're going to wonder, well, what did we spend all that money on to get inferior networks in rural areas? And I do think that requiring openness for public money is absolutely critical. I mean, the whole point of public subsidization is that, and public investment is that you're trying to benefit as many people as possible. And if you encourage closed networks that are going to sort of limit who can benefit, that goes against sort of every sort of sense of the whole point of public investment. So I really think that speeds are important. Certainly there's a minefield that opens up in terms of, well, because carriers have promised certain speeds and they don't actually deliver those speeds, and certainly there's going to be complications there. But we've got to focus on putting in networks that are going to be satisfy not just the current demand, but the demand of the future, and that are going to be scalable for the future, and be able to sort of evolve as technology evolves.
I'm fundamentally opposed to taxpayer dollars going to absentee-owned networks unless there's no hope of a local community-based network emerging in that particular underserved area. And for this reason. One, local networks are going to create local jobs. They're not going to outsource their tech support to India. We're going to be hiring local folks. We hire high school students in mentoring situations so they learn these skills. The jobs are being created locally. You're not going to see that with absentee-owned networks. I'm fundamentally opposed to tax dollars going to support absentee-owned networks. We haven't talked about social capital. One of the most exciting things in the field of economics right now is trying to get your arms around the social capital benefits, and we see that every day with our locally owned networks, both our fiber and our last mile wireless. A developer bought an abandoned school in a remote county north of Asheville. This abandoned school sits in the middle on an island in the middle of a beautiful river. And he wanted to develop it into artist studios, but he wanted to make sure these artists were connected to the world. He wanted to be assured that he would have broadband access. He couldn't find anyone with Verizon to even ask that question because there's no one that you can talk to except the call center, which is located in Florida or wherever. But we were able to give him that assurance, the bank financing, they were okay, and he went ahead and built the project. A weather data entrepreneur has moved and bought a mountaintop because one of the things about the mountains of North Carolina is that we don't have local Doppler radar coverage. It comes out of Tennessee and out of South Carolina. Most of our weather happens below 10,000 feet. The Doppler radar from those two areas looks at what's happening above 10,000 feet. So this guy's got a great idea to create his own mini Doppler from this mountaintop, but he needs broadband. We're able to provide that, and Verizon is just not there. The reason I provided this handout, this is the AT&T building in downtown Asheville, 200 yards from my office. I've been passing by this building for 25 years. I've never seen anyone going in or out that front door. And for the first time, I walked over to take this picture and looked in the front door, and there's a sign there that says, you can make your payments at these 2 grocery store locations. For any other information, call this 800 number. There is no local number for this building, and the only local AT&T representative that I know of in the area, other than the technicians, is a PR guy, and he's a great guy. But if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to do something to test out this invention or this innovation, you need to be able to talk to someone who's actually there managing the network, and that's what local networks provide.
Rob, do you have a last word on this?
Yeah, before I forget, I have to say I agree with Derek. I think the RUS, putting RUS loans, this is not going to work. You're not going to get anything out of it because the numbers don't work on loans in rural areas. They're just the cost is too high. I would put if you're going to do RUS, which is a questionable whether it's RUS or MTI, I'd put it all in grants. Having said that, again, I'll just go back to what I said. There's an inverse graph. The more requirements, quote, public interest requirements you put on these networks, the less investment you will get. And I would not be surprised if by the end of 2009 we would see very little investment that would come out of the stimulus bill as currently structured, because the way the requirements are, they're just not going to work. Stiftel Nicholas just came out yesterday, investment banking advising whatever group, and they said, I didn't print it out, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but they essentially said, and they're advising investors in networks, they essentially said under the House requirements, don't expect Qwest or AT&T to be able to take advantage of these proposals. Now, some of you may say, well, who cares? What do we care about that? The only reason we would care about Qwest and AT&T is they cover, 70% of American homes and a large share of the geography. So we're essentially saying to Western states, good luck, you're not going to get anything. I just don't think that makes any sense. Same thing with openness. By the way, the network I'm on, my 20 meg, I guess it's symmetrical now, fiber to the home network from Verizon. I can go to any website in the world. They don't block me. They don't stop me. That network is, quote, non-discriminatory. What it is not, it's not open in the sense they don't sell it to anybody. And the reason they don't sell it to anybody is because they actually want to make enough money to cover their costs, which are incredibly high to get me fiber to the home. If you put an open requirement on there, essentially a resale environment, you won't get any takers. So last point, yes, we do need to have some requirements. We should have some speed requirements on there, which is what our proposal has. I just wouldn't make them unattainable. And we need to have some rural requirements, which our proposal is there. But if you make these requirements too onerous, we're just not going to have very much investment.
Hey, let's look at some questions. How about closest one here?
Yeah.
And also, tell us who you are and who you work with.
Absolutely. Jeff Daly at Broadband.com, recently turned guerrilla lobbyist. I just wanted to start off by saying quickly, I've been a little frustrated by this discussion. We've talked very little about the specifics of the stimulus that's been proposed and the merits of whether or not it will work quickly, which it won't. It's going to take them 45 days to define the terms of what's inside there. Will it work efficiently? Everyone seems to have doubts about whether or not it's going to actually turn into real deployment. And will it protect the long-term future of rural areas? And I'd say if we're subsidizing DSL deployment, then we're not doing that. Most frustrating of all is that throughout this whole conversation, we've not been talking about loan guarantees, which I think can be the most impactful tool available to us. In my hands right here, I have a market-driven, community-centric approach that can turn a budget of $5 billion in loan guarantees into $40 billion of private investment. And I've got over $3 billion of ready-to-go, shovel-ready projects ready to move right now. It's been a grassroots effort. I'm doing this just because I think it's great for the country. Anyone who works with me to make it happen, come talk to me afterwards. I just want to
send that to us, and we'll put a link on the website for this event so you all can come back and find it. But is there any, hopefully not everybody's going to talk about this, but is there any comments on, just in response to what the House bill actually does, whether it's going to be effective for stimulus and whether it really helps rural areas or not?
I would say I'm not bothered by the fact that the Commission has defined certain terms within 45 days. That's not really that long of a period of time, and we're all up here going to be very busy getting our comments and reply comments to do that. Given the overall size of the stimulus package and given the types of projects that are in there, I don't think it's that big of a deal if some of the broadband elements don't start digging up the trenches and don't start taking place until the end of 2009 and don't get completed until during 2010. We're going to need stimulus beyond just 2009. We're going to need some stimulus, lots of stimulus in 2009, a little stimulus in 2010. If the broadband aspects of that take until then, well, I think that's not something to be too worried about.
Yeah, I want to follow up on this question of how fast we're going to create how many jobs. Let's be clear. The process that's going on here is you walk into the transition team and they say to you, look, we've got a really complex problem. We need a really simple solution in a ridiculously short period of time. Under most circumstances, you would agree that that's not a good way to set public policy. Then they add to that the fact that, and the only thing we care about is the number of jobs I'm going to create this year. That's the second criteria that I would suggest from the point of view of telecom policy is not what you really want to talk about. Let's worry about the second year, and even the fourth year. We have a whole 4 years to work in this administration. So the question of whether we're going to spend the money fast enough and whether we're going to create as many jobs, that's their frame of reference, and that's a shame. I'm not buying into it, okay? I'm worried about good public policy. I think this bill actually did a good thing. The best thing it did is it didn't make a lot of mistakes. It didn't throw $30, $40 billion at tax credits or accelerated depreciation, which would have been useless. So that's a little bit of money that's still in the bank. It also guarantees us that we're going to keep having this debate. And frankly, given my first two observations about how bad this process is for getting good public policy, the fact that we're going to have to keep having this debate is actually a good thing, because we need to get to a better public policy. The bill focused the money on the area that needs it. It's got a mix of incentives. We can argue about the details, but compared to how bad it could have been, it's actually pretty good.
Down the dissent.
Well, I do think this bill is about job creation, and there are 300,000 members of our union who care deeply about this. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed with the bill. I agree with you that it is not going to be fast, it's not going to be effective, and I also think that in terms of a commitment toward maintaining open networks, which I share that commitment, there are two components in the bill. One recognizes that any who get the funding from the government under the program would adhere to the FCC's 4 open internet principles. Those have been proven to be effective in the Comcast case in making sure that there is no blocking. And I think that that is if you're talking about making public policy fast, throwing something that we have not been able to resolve in several years, and that in some ways has stymied moving forward in an area that, regardless of our disagreements, we all agree there's got to be more investment in broadband, and a lot of that has been stymied because too much of our public debate has been about how do you define public policy around an open internet. And we began to make progress, I think, when we saw that the implementation of FCC's open internet principles was indeed, we have to wait and see what the courts say, but the FCC determined that this was a violation of the principles. Putting it into this bill that any who get that money have to adhere to those principles is moving consistent with some vetting that we've already done, but to require the FCC in 45 days to define what it means by open access opens up a food fight that I think is going to mean we're not going to be able to make progress in even getting the $6 billion.
We actually, part of this plan, we already defined open access. I've got a range of both public and private deployers. And we had a week long, yeah.
You have, but all the players in this world have been fighting for 2.5 years over this.
People who are going to be
This
deploying
is not
broadband
the way
in
to
rural
get
America.
money spent fast.
I just
Get a
want
comment from Wally, and then we'll go to another question.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I just want to be clear that we have $26 million in shovel-ready projects ready to go, just among the 4 nonprofit fiber networks, 3 nonprofits, 1 public-private with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And we weren't able to get the 2 telephone co-ops in the northeastern mountains as part of our submission, but those were submitted mid-December. Now, somewhere here in the Capitol there is a pile of submissions of shovel-ready projects. I'd like to know if, what does that look like? Did the big carriers submit shovel-ready projects in underserved areas? That would be good to know. But somebody has access to that information. But I know that we put $26 million in projects on the table that we're ready to start cutting purchase orders and hiring staff and get rolling.
Okay. Yeah, Drew?
Thank you. Drew Clark with Broadband Census. I know Debbie's familiar with the need I feel for getting company by company specific information about broadband by area and speed and price, which of course is what broadbandcensus.com is doing. But I'd like to ask the panel in general on your views about the way that states or the NTIA will be making the investment decisions about where they're going to target the investment dollars that they ultimately have. Given that the existing Broadband Data Act doesn't include any information on speeds, prices, or carriers, what kinds of additional information do you see as necessary for states to have to make rational, efficient decisions?
Well, the short answer is, since the information doesn't exist, what I imagine what they'll do under the structure of the bill is essentially draw lines around what they think are the most rural areas of their state. They're allowed to do up to 20% of rural areas are allowed to be considered under the terms of the NTIA portion of the bill. The other aspect is, for the RUS portion, this determination is entirely up to the Secretary of Agriculture. And bless his heart, I don't know what he knows about where broadband is and how much it costs and what speeds are available. And the track record of that program, I think, is terrible here. To date, 45% of all the loans and grants have been used to deploy broadband to homes that already have service available from 2 or more competitors. And this is under a program that's ostensibly supposed to give priority to areas that doesn't have any service. So I think the FCC is going to have some better data start trickling in next March. I really wish they would have completed the further notice and dealt with the issues of complete availability and price and speed. But I think there's going to be enough information coming out of the Commission that if states request it, and which they're allowed to do under S1492, that they can make reasonable guesses about where is the best areas in their states to target this money.
Okay. Yeah, right here.
Yes, I'm Bruce Hahn with the American Homeowners Grassroots Alliance, and I have 2 questions. The first for Rob, and the kind of the flip side of that question for Wally. Both Wally and Mark have stated the problems they perceive with tax credit approach. The question for Rob is, how could you sharpen the tax credits, or what would you do to assure that they achieve the intended purpose? The flip side of that for Wally is Debbie, and I think Rob too, have pointed out some of the challenges for grants for organizations like yours. How do you assure, with things like matching requirements or the California examples, that the money that is spent on grants is spent wisely and achieves the same kind of objectives that you see lacking in a tax credit approach?
Well, Bruce, as you know, I used to work for the Progressive Policy Institute, and we used to always talk about the third way, and I think our proposal is the third way. There were proposals put out by industry that would ask for full expensing or tax credits on 100% of spend, and I think that was too extreme. I think that's just rewarding stuff that would have happened already. If you look at the Warburg study, it suggests a decline in CapEx in 2009 of 10%. Probably that's a conservative number of CapEx decline. So setting your base at 85% suggests that you're going to reward new investment. Now, is that going to be for every single company? Of course not. The ideal would be God would be able to look at the balance sheets of every single company and predict exactly what they're going to do, and then you say, okay, everything above that you're going to get a credit. We don't do that. We already have a credit, by the way, called the R&D credit, which is an incremental credit which supports R&D, and it's very effective. I'm happy to share with you all the economic studies that have ever been done on that all show it works quite well. The reason it works, the reason we do it is because we realize there's an externality in the next big externality in broadband. So the fact that There's some parts of the credit that are targeted to places that don't have any, which suggests you're not going to get any investment there unless you have an incentive, a grant, or a tax credit. And then you've got this 85%. I think those are pretty good safeguards.
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, if you've got a local group or organization that knows its community, granted they may not have the level of sophisticated experience that the big carriers have in operating these huge networks, but we're not talking about rocket science these days. The digitization of technology. We're a small ISP. We have a very small staff. The fiber networks that I'm describing are not very big operations, but they know how to do fiber route mapping. They know how to do pole attachment agreements and so forth. They know how to create a secure location for their equipment. So I'm not that concerned. Yeah, you got to make sure that folks have a certain level of sophistication. But your question reminded me of something I hadn't really thought about. When I sat on the North Carolina Rural Internet Access Authority, we put out incentive grants, some to create broadband infrastructure in underserved areas. And it didn't occur to me until now that those surviving networks were those that were community-based. The commercial operators, and I'm not talking about Embark. Embark got some of this money, and Verizon got a little bit of it to extend DSL. But it was the nonprofit community-based groups that have survived. It was the for-profit folks that failed. One of which was a tragic failure in Graham County, one of the most isolated counties in the mountains of North Carolina, which was an incredibly strong county for us in terms of dial-up. And they were very discouraged when we didn't get that grant. It was a guy out of Gastonia, I think, and he came in and tried to make a go of it, but he lived in Gastonia, not in the mountains. But I guess he had a home up there. But and then he pulled the plug after the money ran out. So I think because local groups know their community, they're more likely to be successful and be held accountable.
We could take one last question here since we're running out of time. How about if you two there actually just give us one each, and then we'll give the panel one last chance to comment on whichever is more relevant or any closing thought that they have.
Joanne Lewis, Columbia Telecommunications. My question is, for those of you who do support the open access requirement in the NTIA part of the House bill, how would you like to see the FCC define that open access requirement?
Well, let's get the. Did you have a question?
Me?
No.
No, I was just going to make an observation. I've just returned from 2.5 months of working in Albania, designing a nationwide network. And the irony is that it's being paid for by U.S. money. And I'm working at the Prime Minister's level, discussing all of these aspects. And the government of Albania is giving all assets, fiber assets, vertical assets. U.S. aid is providing stimulus money for broadband connectivity outside of the cities, because I don't permit my projects to build inside cities. It's rural development, and so it's ironic that the U.S. is doing this.
Thanks, Glenn. So what can we do about open access in 45 days? Any other closing
actually,
comment?
in 45 days, so frankly, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the FCC could adopt the 4 freedoms as the policy. But the interesting thing is that, let's be clear, tying it to the loan makes them enforceable. And that's what is up in the air in the court case, right? So in a certain sense, Congress is saying that those 4 freedoms are enforceable for any projects that are built under this program. So in fact, this is going to be a really easy proceeding. The FCC simply says we affirm our 4 freedoms, and obviously they're enforceable for anybody who gets this money. Which is where we are, we hope, in the the rest of the space, and this is not a complex process. There are other people who want more, but for now, that level of open access is what we have, and on 45 days' notice, that's all we can ask for.
This is a great question, and is one I was hoping wouldn't be asked because it makes me squirm, because it's really difficult to answer. I think Cooper's right in that the minimum definition that this would mean is the 4 principles. What we will probably end up recommending is that in condition for receiving this grant money, that the recipient has the obligation to engage in good faith negotiations for wholesale access from anyone that actually requested. I don't think that's actually a problem for rural areas, because actually a lot of these networks have still opted to be regulated under Title II anyway, and they're happy. Organization like NTCA has said it's happy to meet all Title II obligations on its broadband networks. I don't think it's something in general that will discourage companies from participating. There was a very interesting report that came out from the Yankee Group that actually said a lot of these companies that are building fiber to the home projects are getting 30% take rates, and the way that they could actually get those take rates up higher is if they engage with wholesale partners. They'll actually be able to get a return on their investment much quicker. So again, I think the most reasonable definition is some sort of obligation to engage in good faith wholesale negotiations.
Yeah, I would agree with Derek. I think anytime that you're essentially funding the entire network, I mean, it's essentially paid for by tax dollars. The notion that you wouldn't have any sort of sense of wholesale access to that facilities, and you would create either monopolies or duopolies in an area seems counterproductive and just not good policy. And so it's tax dollars that should go to benefit as many people as possible, and that includes as much competitors that a market can handle.
I don't see how you make a business case with a rural network without being open. You need as many customers as possible. But if it's an absentee-owned network glommed into a rural area that's part of a larger Wall Street business model that's proprietary, it's not going to be profitable, it's going to be neglected. And that's what we've seen for generations in rural America.
I know this is going to come to a surprise to you, but I don't agree. Let me read a quote to you from, by the way, the case study example of this that we can look at is Utopia in Utah, which is basically failing. And so the business model was you're going to put fiber down, it's going to be an open network. Well, that model in Provo at least was sold to Broadweave. Broadweave CEO says, quote, says that inefficiencies resulted from a lack of integration between service provider operations and network operations, delaying service activation and troubleshooting. So here they've even moved away from that model because it doesn't work. Now again, you can have a nice argument about whether you should have openness, but if you make that the requirement, you're not going to have very much investment in there because those systems simply don't work.
So you're talking about wholesale open access?
Can I respond to that? Because that's not, I think we're talking about different things. In Utah, they're dealing with wholesale only. Under state law, they're not permitted to provide retail services. Under state law in Utah, Utopia and the Provo network were not permitted to provide retail services themselves. They could only sell. They could only wholesale. Open access is generally understood to mean you can provide your own services, as Wally does, and you would sell to other providers as well, but you wouldn't close your network. Those are two different business models. So looking at what happened in Utah and using that as a sign of an across-the-board failure of the open access model just seems to be looking at two different things, comparing apples and oranges.
Happy to certainly discuss that after you. I think the point he's making, though, is when you have two providers and you got a problem, whether one's retail, one's wholesale, where do you go, who fixes it? I think there are a lot of inherent problems there.
Well, the actual practical reality is that
you're not going to get investment.
in most rural America, you won't see anyone coming in asking to be a wholesaler or to get wholesale access to a network. The business case is not there. But it is an important protection to at least have there as a sort of backstop. But again, I don't think it would even be taken advantage of in most places, which is why it's important that we have the 4 principles and a principle of non-discrimination layered on top of that.
The other point is that Title II worked for about 70 years pretty well, and there's no reason to assume that it couldn't work for another 70 years. It's just that telephone companies have a higher rate of profit in mind by being able to exercise market power over the networks, which common carriage and Title II prevented them from for 70 years. So the notion that you can't have investment or run a network under Title II just is contrary to the experience of
the telecom network from the 34 Act until certainly 2002, when Title II was repealed for information service, internet service.
Debbie, do you have any last comment?
She asked for those who support open access to comment. I support an open internet enforced by the FCC's open internet principles.
Okay. So we can make one more time. All right, well, thank you, everyone, for attending and good questions. Thanks to the panel.